Great. Okay, I'm going to go
I do
ahead
have the
and,
visual, yeah, but it's not expanded.
Great. Great. Wonderful. I'll go ahead and get started then. So first of all, thanks to everyone for listening in. And this has been something that I've been pursuing and studying for years. And it's a really fun, exciting thing to be able to share some of these stories with you all. But I'm going to quickly begin with the story of a student. And she was a special needs student, one of my students, who used to talk about, she wrote an essay one time on math, and she used to talk about how math was like eating raw flour when she wasn't even hungry. And so that experience for her obviously was something where she did not, that experience for her was obviously something where she didn't really think of mathematics in a way that was deeply rich for her. And so part of what we're going to try to do today is to change that experience of mathematics from raw flour to something that's like cake, something where we've added the additional ingredients into it so that it's something that's an experience where a student can grasp mathematics and not feel the deep pain that they have. And that's a really big story across most students in mathematics in the United States. So that's where we'll get started with today. How do we change it from raw flour to cake? I'm going to start with 3 graphs. And I'd like for you just to spend a minute to take a look at those graphs. I'll put all 3 of them up. And for just a second, take a look at them without having the information on them. And they all tell a story. Excuse me, I'm out of breath though. The phone rang here. I'm an answering machine. And so if you take a look at these 3 graphs, they all tell a story about the United States and mathematics related to that story. And so that's where we're going to begin. For years, I was a math teacher, and only 28% of my students were proficient in mathematics. And part of the story of this is to try to figure out what it was that we needed to do to try to be able to help those students. How could we potentially get them up and over the curve? Because this is like 1 out of 4 students that are proficient in mathematics. And so a big part of what I've done is to try to help understand how we get to that place. If you take a look at the United States, and this is really the story. Sorry, it's taken me a second to sink back into it after the phone's been ringing here. But this is really the big story in the United States, and that is that in the U.S., if you are a student, most students in the United States are proficient when they're in 4th grade. And by the time they're in 8th grade, they've dropped off. And that drop-off is the greatest drop-off in the world. It's one of the biggest stories that we have, that that drop is greater than any other country anywhere in the world. And we call it the mid-school math cliff. And the question is, why does that happen? What's happening in the top countries, and this is something I had a chance to do with that Gates Foundation grant, is to take a look at all these different top-scoring countries, and why is it that they're doing so well? One of the biggest things that we see is that teachers in these countries use a ubiquitous strategy. They all use the same strategy where they present to students a problem. They then have those students strategize about how to solve that problem. And then they actually give them a test. If you see something here that's interesting, is they have almost no instruction, which seems totally counterintuitive to everything that we would think of. In the United States, it's the exact opposite. What we tend to do is we tend to teach the procedure. We give the students study time, and then after that, then we give them a test. The question is why would that possibly make a difference? And this is one of the major things that we hope that you might be able to take away when you're working with your children at home. And that is that when students are strategizing about a problem, they are using thinking strategies. And what happens is that when we give them the information, what they do with that is that they memorize. The two different approaches are really a big deal in terms of what happens in the long arc of a student learning mathematics. It's good till 4th grade. You can memorize till then. It's good till 5th grade. You can memorize till then. But then we start to see that drop off. So that's a big part of the process. Why? What's happening? Well, one of the major things that we found, so I had a chance to look at thousands of kids across the United States in all these different classrooms in the past couple of years. And what we found is that whenever that question was out there, the child had the engine in their mind to keep going. The question was the engine, not the information. A lot of students are not necessarily attuned to that information, but they are attuned to the question. And one of my professors, who I dearly loved, he was 86 years old, and I had him in his last class that he taught his life. And Art would say, the biggest problem in education is the giving of answers to questions that have not yet been asked. And this is something that's really core to how we approach everything in education. If we think of it as information-driven, what we're doing is shutting down that natural curiosity in a child. So tip number one, really simple. Give a problem but not the solution. It seems crazy to go, well, yeah, we're not going to take our kids out and go drive without having given them some piece of information. That's true. The difference in this is that kids are desiring, obviously, to drive. When they're 16, the very first thing they want to do is go out and get their license so they can drive to another place. They have that question in mind. They start that way with mathematics. But what happens is, over a period of when they're 6, when they're 7, when they're 8, and they're 9, they're 10, we're giving them the information that they need, but it's slowly eroding that curiosity. The thing that we have to keep in mind is that we've got to focus on giving them the problem. Well, why is it happening in the United States versus, say, Korea or one of these other countries? One of the biggest things that we find out in the United States is that if we look at the amount of information we have the largest curriculum in the world. If you purchase a textbook in the United States, it's in 7th grade now, the average size is 848 pages. In Korea, average size 7th grade textbook is only 333. So it's a big, big difference between the amount of information that we have. And again, that process of giving the information that's slowly shutting down that engine. So tip number 2 is that less is more. We don't have to give as much as we think that we need to give. There's some really important concepts in mathematics. When we're in 7th grade, proportional relationships, how the numbers relate to each other is very, very important. But we don't necessarily need to be studying differential calculus at that point. So understanding a few concepts. The third part to it, too, what's in that curriculum? This is the part that I find, this is part of my work where I'm so excited to share with you today, is that a lot of problems that you'll see, the word problem, it says, Jamar's phone plan allows for 400 texts per month. He wants to graph those texts. But the thing that we find about that is that Jamar probably doesn't really care about graphing his text. It's something that's meant to be relevant because it's in the modern age, but it's probably not as relevant as one would think that it is. It's not a truly relevant problem to this child. And so typical textbook problems normally will lack a relevance to a student's life. So what do we do as homeschool parents? How do we possibly think about that in a different way? One example that I use in my class that that I've seen other teachers use as well is we'll try to ask really big questions, and we'll try to pick something that could be potentially engaging. One of the things that we did this year is I took my students, as you saw, all over the national news, and it said, everybody get a flu shot. It's a huge pandemic. So we studied the 1918 pandemic of the flu, and we asked the question, how effective is the flu vaccine? And then the students went out and gathered their own original data on that. That's what made it interesting. The question itself is interesting because they were asking their grandparents, did you get the flu shot this year? Did you get sick? How did you get sick? Those were some of the questions we asked, and then we compiled that data. And the really fun part to it was that it was relevant and meaningful to them because they had gone out and collected it. As a classroom, they had done that, and you can do that. As a homeschool mom, you can have your students ask the big questions in life. Is the flu shot effective? Is just one of 1,000 of them. So those are some of the ideas. And then I use this word rich story problem as opposed to rich word problem. Story is, it's bigger than a word problem. It's bigger than the characters actually make sense. Who are the characters in the story of the flu? Well, the characters are grandma and granddad. The characters are my little brother or sister who was sick. So those are questions that can be analyzed with numerical data that we then care about. What do we do with that data once we've collected it? Or any mathematical concept. It doesn't have to be just data. One of the things that's most powerful that we tend to leave out is we don't create a visual of it. In this case, what was incredible is the students went out and found out that the effectiveness of the flu shot was above 50% if you were below 65. But the effectiveness of the flu shot, if you were above 65, was just above 20%. And now all the students have this very powerful story. How effective is the flu shot? Well, it's different for different ages. And of course, the flu shot is most important for people who are over 65. So now we've got a rich question about what to even do with this data. We have a visual for it, we've collected it, and now we're starting to comprehend what math really means in the world. And so finally, we took this, after we visualized the concept, the students then took that, and we decided that we would do a radio show with them. Why would we do a radio show with math? Why is that important? Why wouldn't we just take the data and say, let's go ahead and paint them and put them up on a fridge? And the reason is that when we can create an external audience, something that's not just mom, something that's not just dad, something that's not just brother and sister, but something that's an audience that's external to who we are, what we've done is we put it to use. And that was a quote that when I was showing this with Brett, putting the math to use is a really important aspect to it because it will anchor all of the mathematical concepts. I'm not saying you have to do this with every single thing that you study in it, nor am I saying that everything that you do study has this opportunity. But some of the ideas we want to take to a point where we create that external audience. So all in all, what's it look like? We've got the problem. We're giving them less information than we normally would. We're making that into something that's irrelevant, meaningful, rich. And I said word problem here, but it's a story problem. We're visualizing the concepts, and we're creating an audience. And all of that is done in a deep, meaningful way with one thing. So you're trying to take one area and going big with it. And what that allows you to do is that all the other concepts that you're teaching then fall into that. They become, it's like having a coat hanger. The student now has a coat hanger for all these other concepts that they're learning. They're like, oh, wait a minute. This has practical use here. This would have practical use. As you're building those coat hangers over time, it's something that the student can attach these concepts to. Otherwise, those tiny little mathematical concepts are in different pieces, and they're just kind of all over the place. And they don't have anything to attach them to in the mind. And so the only way that a student can get through them is by memorizing. Why is it so important? Well, if you can think about this, if you've ever had I remember when I was a kid, my parents got an appliance one time, and they were all excited about that appliance. It was a dishwasher. And what I was excited about was the box. If you can think about when you were a kid, adults tend to look at the appliance, but if you're a kid and you're in the mind's eye of a child, that child is interested in the box. What can the box be used for? what's it about? Could it be a fort? Could it be a spaceship? And, you know, Howard Gardner used to say that a creative individual weds the most advanced understandings with a curiosity of that as a wonder-filled child. And when we're after these areas of study, when we think about mathematics is hard to learn. It's like riding a skateboard. So the kids won't give up on riding a skateboard because even though it's hard, they are finding meaning within that process. And that's something that too often we tend to say, oh, you know what, we've got to learn this. So it's just something to hold in part of our hat, that that's what we're after. Curiosity is the most powerful thing there, and James Cameron says. The trick is this, and this is where I'm hoping the presentation will start to make total sense, is that trying to find those problem sets is often like looking for a needle in the haystack. We go, oh gosh, they're so difficult because studying the flu sounds great for a class, but it would be very difficult for me to do that in my own home because I'm not too sure of it. Or I'm trying to think about something that would be meaningful and relevant for my 13-year-old daughter who's in dance, but she's thinking about dance a lot, and I don't know how to make math make sense with dance just yet. And so the thing that I have a friend who works in this area, he basically says that the problem is not trying to find a needle in the haystack. It's finding something that is like the needle in the haystack. When you look at the Apollo 13 the crew, and they needed to be able to fix what had happened on their ship, that they didn't have the materials that were the exact materials that fit for it. What they had were materials that could act like that. And so they used duct tape, they used packaging material, and these other scavenged items from the craft to be able to rebuild ultimately what was their lithium hydroxide canisters to get the air circulation system going. They didn't look for the needle. They were looking for something that would fit like the needle. And that's the thing I would encourage you as a homeschool mom or homeschool dad to try to think about. If my daughter's interested in dance, how could math fit here? What does it mean? It doesn't mean that we've got a dance curriculum that's related to mathematics. It means that we've found something that's like that needle in the haystack. Why is it so important? So my friend researches how many questions people ask, and when they're at different ages. They find that over a period of time, I have a 6-year-old son, and he asks a lot of questions every day. And if you can imagine, the one word that each question starts with is why. He goes, why, Daddy? Why this? Why that? Why this about the sun? Why this about the moon? Why this about the trees? He's asking those questions over and over again. And over time, we slowly start to ask fewer questions until the age of about 44. And then beyond that age, the number of questions starts to increase again. But normally it's like, where? Where are my keys? Where's my wallet? Where are my glasses? It's not necessarily those questions that fill us with wonder in the world. And as we started to look at that tremendous drop-off that we see in the United States, and this huge amount of curriculum that we have, it's overwhelming curriculum, the thing that we found was that students were losing their curiosity, and they were fundamentally stopping to ask questions about why with mathematics. And what we found is, when we saw students in these other countries, that because the curriculum was smaller, because they were given a problem and not given a solution to them, they maintained those why questions longer. And those were the things that kept their learning high. You've probably heard it before. You entered school. I know that you all are homeschooled, but we're still trying to think about those things as question marks and graduate as periods. So there's mystery graph. There's one. Mystery graph shows the size of our textbooks as compared to the other countries that are performing well. What about this one? That graph just happens to be how our students in the country rate strategies of learning, the strategy of memorization to learn mathematics. In the countries that perform well, across the board rate memorization is a very low, very unimportant skill, and that memorization in the United States is sort of noticed as one of the highest strategies that's used. We just did our own study of that. Found that 85% of US students use memorization as their top strategy to learn math. It's a very number one. In Finland, for example, the students rate it as the least important. We see differences in how they're performing. So again, we're trying to avoid only rote memorization. I'm not saying it doesn't have value, but we ought not to be rating it as number one. It ought to be 2 or 3 or 4. And then finally, you know this one already, that's our rating compared to other countries in the world on international math scales. You saw USA Today just a couple of months ago, USA Today, where our 4th grade students are performing really well in the world. We were ranked 8th. It's really great. It's phenomenal. The challenge is that by the time they get to 10th grade, they're 25th out of 34 countries. And that drop is, as I mentioned before, it's the largest in the world. It doesn't happen to any of the other countries. They're either performing poorly or they're performing well, and they sort of stay there. So why do we see that? Your last part, this is my last slide to it. People ask me all the time, like, well, what should I buy? What should I go out and get? And I was talking with Brett a little bit about this. I get all the different sources. I get books. I get videotapes. We have games that we use. We use all of the different products and bring them in. But we bring them in as resources that surround us related to a larger thought process, which is that we start with that question, and once we get to the end of that question, then we haven't just simply spelled out the answer. We're trying to explore the things in life that are rich and meaningful. And so those are the first things I hope help with this, and I hope that they help present a few questions to you. I'm happy to answer any questions, and now that I've caught my breath, I appreciate being able to share some of these really fun ideas. It's just it's amazing to see what happens in the classroom. And so if anyone has any questions, feel free to go ahead and you can type them in, and we'll take a look and try to answer them as best as possible.
Okay, can you hear me, Scott?
I sure can.
Okay, well, people are collecting their thoughts and getting their questions typed in. I'll ask you a couple of my own. Actually, it's not so much a question as it's a conclusion. Listening to your presentation, it seems like what you're saying basically is that as a society, we really don't know how to teach math, or at least we're not using the best practices for teaching math. And then what's more, there's a vast amount of curriculum that has been developed around in support of a methodology that, according to you, is not very effective. You know, this methodology that starts with lecture and then study and then test, as opposed to starting with a problem and letting the students teach it. So I almost feel kind of hopeless that, you know, there's not the knowledge of how to teach it in this country, and then there's not the curriculum to support it. Am I being too pessimistic?
Well, Brett, I think the reason why it's pessimistic is only because I've seen 1,000 times over the switch turn on for students when all we do is reverse the direction. All we're doing is, instead of giving that information first, we're creating an environment for learning. Time is best spent creating a need to know rather than giving the information to a student. So we created that need for them. And it takes a little bit more time initially, but then it takes less work on the other end. So it's almost like painting your house, where if you've spent enough time like actually preparing everything, you've got your drop cloth down, and you've done all the work to prepare so that you don't have to worry about the paint spills or something like that, it's going to go more smoothly. And in this particular case, all we're doing is starting to think about the world mathematically in the sense that we're trying to create questions. And in our own lives, we use math every single day. And so a part of this that's such a simple solution is being transparent about it. My dad used to get the Wall Street Journal, and the times when you couldn't get stock quotes online, and so we would read that every day, and he would ask me questions. Well, if you bought a couple of shares of this and it went from here to here, what would your gain be? And I was 6 when he went through that activity. Parents obviously have thought about and heard about the ratios and proportions related to cooking. The curriculum itself that we purchase is there for support. And it's not that the curriculum itself is bad, it's that it is useful, but it's useful in the framework that we're just flipping it so that it's, instead of it being that I take this curriculum and give that information to my students, I'm trying to think about how I can frame a question where those concepts would be useful. So we spend a little more time. We just spend a little more time in the preparation phase. But then it's easy. It's not hope. I guess it's not hopeless. It's hopeful because it'll light a fire for them for the next 10 years of their life, or forever.
Okay. Well, let's take some of these questions that are coming in. So Jane Ellen asks, what strategies do successful countries use to teach? If not memorization, then what? And I think your first answer to that was that they start with a story or a problem, right? Did I get that right?
That's right. They use what we call a thinking strategy. One of the strategies is to relate a concept that they would learn in a textbook to a situation where it might be useful in real life. That's the #1 strategy that's used in all of the top 4 performing countries. That's the #1 choice. So they take anything that's in their text and relate that to something where it might be used in real life, and they actually practice that explicitly. So a teacher would say, 8 plus 8, where might we actually use that in our real life? And they would spend more time thinking about where it was used than just getting the numerical value of 16.
So in these other countries that are using this approach, it sounds like that. Do they have textbooks that are designed to use this strategy, or is it just the teachers have been trained to use the strategy with whatever the textbook is?
It's a combination of both, but it's primarily that the textbooks are very small and the teachers are trained to use that strategy. So the teachers are the ones building those connections, not the textbook. The reason that they do that is because there's a belief that you can't build those connections except locally. And I say locally within that culture. I don't mean within the broad culture of the country, but locally within that classroom and within that student, within that household, or for example, in a homeschooling situation. How do we build an example? I might use one with my son. I know has to do with Legos and Star Wars, but for another child, that may have 0 application. So those are we have to build them locally.
Okay, so Nikki asked the question: should we switch to a curriculum similar to what they use in Finland, Japan, etc.? So, that kind of sparks for me. Well, suppose we took a curriculum they use in Finland, for example, and translated it into English. Would it be that easy? Would that work? Or does it get back to teacher training?
Well, I would say we should use all the curriculums, whether it's from Japan or Singapore or Finland. My personal opinion of Singapore math, so I used, in my own classrooms, I would use 12 different textbooks. But the main thing I would do with that is I would build from all 12 different textbooks. I would have the students build their own. They would create their own version of that. And that was much smaller in their own words, and it was much more finite. No, I don't think that we have to switch to another curriculum. I don't think that's going to be effective. It's all already out there. The question is not having access to a different curriculum that's out there. I would have all those resources, because in every single one you'll find a gem. It's
well, but as you know, I mean, our audience can't go buy 15 different textbooks and then
right.
make the best of it. I mean, lots of folks are using like Saxon Homeschool,
Sure.
for example. So I take it. So what would you're saying
Homeschool would be just fine.
Yeah. So you're saying use Saxon Homeschool, but basically as you're starting a new chapter, take a look at what it's all about, and then try to think of how to make that relevant to your child. Is that what you would say?
That's what I'd say. And then a really important piece of this is a translation that goes through the homeschool students so that they build their own, because that becomes the really meaningful, relevant context from it. So Saxon's fine. You use Saxon, and you're able to take examples from it and concepts and ideas that you'd never be able to think of yourself and use it as a guide. Just use the student textbook as the one that's developed from within from that. So it's a much smaller, much more finite. You're trying to pick out the things that you think are priorities.
So are you saying that you would work with your child to kind of create your own textbook?
Absolutely, but using another resource to start. I would hate to go about that just inventing it from scratch. That would be difficult.
Huh. Well, we've got a lot of questions here, so let's kind of go for them. Jan, go forward with them. Jan asks, I have a student working on fractions, and he is frustrated in knowing when to multiply or when to divide in a word problem. He wants a quick tip to know without thinking. Do you think working on fewer problems a day but make them real? I guess she means, is that the way to go? Work on fewer problems but make them real? Relevant?
Most definitely. Fewer problems, deeper understanding is a major tenet across the board, in that that applies to fractions specifically. And the other part too, and this is just a little piece of advice, go slower than you would ever think you need to at this stage. Meaning that some parents and some folks try to get into this a little bit too quickly, and boy, we should be here. The research is very clear about this, especially related to fractions, because fractions are helping us think proportionally. 4/5 is a proportion, right? So as we're trying to think about what that even means, we've got a lot of different contexts to try to understand it. A couple of problems a day, trying to make those meaningful and trying to really understand what they mean is more valuable at this stage. There will come a time later when you can go with more problems and go faster. Consistency and progression, but start slower than you would think.
Okay, good. I like that. Jamie has an observation, and see what you think about this. She says, I believe that the same practice of just inundating students with info instead of asking questions and letting the students seek the answer is an issue in more than just math. I saw it over and over in many subjects my kids were learning before I pulled them out of school. Any comments?
That's right. Sure. It's Art would lean over to us and even say the biggest problem in education is the giving of answers to questions that have not yet been asked. And that it is a major issue in all types of schools. It's a major issue in our world, right? We're bombarded by an immense amount of media. And so it's a part of our world that we have to deal with. But yes, of course, it's everywhere.
So Jamie had a follow-up question. She said, couldn't we use the same technique you're talking about with other subjects? And has anyone studied how students in other subjects or in other countries perform in other subjects?
They have, and I don't know the literature nearly as well. I know that U.S. students perform better in reading than they do in math by a huge margin. Across the board, they start relatively high, and then they end somewhat above average. There's some reasons why that's the case. Our instructional methods in the U.S. are actually more closely aligned to what we know about how people learn. That said, I think the principle applies. Curiosity is what keeps that going, what keeps us going. And in our world, There's too much information to learn. We can't learn it all. So we've got to learn the mechanisms of how to learn. They become the foundation.
Right.
So I think that applies to any subject.
We have a couple of questions from Monica and Ann touching on really the same thing, which is, when to start the methodology you're talking about. Monica says, should we continue with our current memorization curriculum through 4th grade and then create the story problem method, or would you recommend starting earlier? And Ann is saying, just to clarify, we start these strategies at 4th or 5th grade. Again, she's asking, should we start them earlier?
A wonderful question. It's a great, wonderful question. The research is absolutely clear on this one. It's really a wonderful thing to see. My son is now mathematically studying the effects of plastic in our world, plastic bottles, and he's always telling me I've got to make sure I recycle. Sometimes I can't, and I'm trying to hide it. Like, oh gosh, it's a complex world we live in. The questions that he's asking are really big, and they help motivate him for some of the memorization that he needs to do. We're not throwing out the idea that we want to learn our multiplication tables. I would be remiss in saying that. That frees up our working memory. It's just that our major focus throughout the arc of the entire curriculum is always on those big questions in life. Why this? Why that? And that we have those as our anchors, and they become some of the big building blocks. We still memorize. We still practice the ability to free up our working memory for things like multiplication tables. So doing both at once is the most correct sort of answer. Repetition is still fine.
So, but you would start with this storytelling approach or this problem-solving approach from grade 1, from kindergarten, or was it more appropriate later?
From grade 1, it would be a perfect time, or even kindergarten, and or younger. Again, we're thinking about how math makes sense in the world, and the sooner that we can do that, the more sort of coat hangers that we have to attach those concepts to later, the more easily they're remembered.
Okay. Christine asked, do you think the focus on quote-unquote spiral methodology instead of mastery of concepts has an effect on the learning outcomes? So spiral meaning that we're going to learn a concept, and then, as I understand spiral methodology, it would mean that the next time we're not going to necessarily study that. We've already learned it and we're moving on, versus mastery of a certain concept. Art used to say this too. He would say learning is not just learning new things, but it's learning the same things in a deeper, more meaningful way. And as I study middle school mathematics, just basic or middle school math, I'm constantly learning a new nuance to it that's allowing me to make it more useful into my own life. And so I would simply say that mastery of concepts is we have to relearn concepts over and over. It just doesn't mean that we're learning exactly the same thing. So I think they actually work. I think the truth is, in reality, the two of them are very close together if they're done properly. I think mastery spirals up. Okay. Let's try a question from Nedra. My son is interested in formulas that include multiplication and division before he's even started learning multiplication. How do I bridge the gap? He will go online and find out what a formula means. For example, F equals MA, some other ones. And he found out that it is the formula for the speed of light.
Well, first of all, that's really exciting. That's really fun to hear. And may not entirely know multiplication. Again, that combination of them both. What's going to happen for him is that multiplication will hold some meaning. And it does not mean, again, when we talk about these things, my students trained on multiplication tables if they did not know them, because it's just too powerful of a skill. So we're not negating the fact that we need to have some repetition, but to have both of those and have this interest in a concept is just a wonderful thing. How do you bridge them? I think balancing time would be the first part to it. I don't know his age, but I would not hammer in those multiplication tables so much as I train them very slowly using progression. First time we're looking at them, it's just a few minutes. Next time we're looking at them, it's a few minutes more. Sort of like running a marathon. We don't go all the way to the end. Just piece by piece by piece.
Okay. Well, Jan has a kind of a similar question. She asks, how much time a week or day would you recommend spending on math?
Well, depends on the age of my child. So age appropriateness is a huge part to this. I personally work with Kendrick, who is my son. I work with him about 8 minutes a day doing his homework, and he's done some math already at home in school. So he's probably doing a grand total of about 24 minutes of math each day. That seems to be about right for him. He's 6. He's going on 7. That's probably a little shy of where we might be when we're older. But one of the most amazing pieces of understanding comes from the FAA, the Federal Aviation Group, and that is that they studied when pilots were learning how to fly a plane, the pilots that learned in the smallest, shortest pieces and learned the most slowly were the ones that made the fewest mistakes later, meaning that it was better to have good concentration for 35 minutes than it was to be really focused on something for an hour and 45 minutes. And that what happened is they had that gradual progression, more time, more time, more time later. So a 16-year-old is probably going to need some additional training beyond 24 minutes a day. In terms of exact numbers, consistency and progression from wherever you are is the key.
Okay. Jan asks if students should create their own math discovery journal.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no other answer to that. It's perfect.
Yeah, I like that. That's a pretty cool idea. So they just kind of keep a journal of what they're discovering in math and write it down. It gets back to one of your tips, which is putting it to use, or finding it. Well, I guess it's not finding an audience exactly, but it is putting it to use.
It's putting it to use, and it's allowing for creation. And I think we're all beings where we want to create and add value to the world. And I actually haven't done that before. I'm going to I'll steal that idea if that's okay.
Thank you, Jan. Way to go. You rock. Jamie has some questions I think really kind of capture the spirit of the discussion. She says, so we should cut down on the piles of work and work harder on facilitating an interest in the student in learning the concepts, not just memorizing piles of numbers, to hopefully help them understand the reasons behind those numbers?
Most definitely. There is a huge, between those two where, we go back to basics or we are focused on, some people would simply say maybe the new math. The two of those really are not against each other. They work in unison. You don't need to call them or give them those names. By creating something that's meaningful and relevant and focusing on the interest, spending time building that, it allows for us, when those questions arise, to have the opportunity to provide those experiences of training, those experiences where we can go through things of repetition, where we've got to do it over and over again to understand it. It's just that at current, the large emphasis is on more information and memorization. So we're just swinging the pendulum back a little bit towards the middle.
Right. Now, Terry has a question I think would be relevant to lots of our listeners. It says, how do we teach advanced math if we as a parent aren't strong in mathematics? How can we introduce the concept if it's difficult for us to understand?
That's such a wonderful thing. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge that a large part of what I feel like my work is doing is sometimes even my own therapy. I even have that fear come up because here I am. I work with students, and then I run into something that I don't understand. I'm in a room with people who are much smarter than I am, and I even feel that fear arise. And so by recognizing that is is really the first step to it. Then the next part to it, though, is we don't need to be the sole resource for that. And when it comes to certain mathematical concepts that are too difficult, if we have exceeded our abilities, then we might have to, for one, one of the most beneficial things we can do is model learning of them so that we show how we might learn them and try to make that transparent. The best teachers are actually not, it's not Michael Jordan who can dunk and we're a 6 or 7 or 8 or 10-year-old. The best teachers are just those models who are a little bit better than we are. And so if you can model some of that learning, that's going to be greatly helpful. If it reaches a point where that's beyond the scope of reasonability, you don't have 4 hours to put into learning, Calculus 2 or something like this. There's nothing wrong with having an additional resource. And one of the things I find is that in my own classes, what I try to do is I try to plan in 5, 6, 7, 8 guest speakers every semester who would come in and help me with certain things, especially in the upper level courses that I might teach. So I'm trying to draw on those resources to help me.
Okay. Let's see. I think Jamie had a follow-up question. So should we do mastery of concepts as we also do a spiral approach? We should teach deeper meaning of a smaller amount of areas and keep returning to those areas over time to achieve deeper and deeper understanding?
Yes, and at the same time, extending ourselves ever so slightly beyond where we were at certain points. You think of the principles of just about any type of learning. One of the basic parts to it are that we're constantly going back to the old to understand it better in a deeper, more meaningful way. And then there's the occasional time when we want to look for those things that are new. And to do that, where if we can build that in consistently into our plan, it's going to be a lot more effective. There's some days we just make easy days. There's some days we should have rest, where we're going back in the old concepts, we know them well, we only do them for a little while. It allows the body and the mind, right, not so much separate, but it allows for us to really solidify those concepts so that the next time when we do something that's a little more difficult, we're freed up to think about those new things. It's kind of like RAM in a computer. If it's doing too much, it's not going to be able to function really well when we add a new application. So keeping with a simple for a couple of days or a reboot or something like that. But yes, both of them make sense, spiraling and mastery.
Okay. And another question about how much time to spend on math, but this time for middle school students. Is there any kind of general guideline or rule of thumb?
Yeah, and for middle school students, I'm going to know them best because I've worked with them for 15 years. And so as a general guideline, you want to have a pattern where it's not the exact same every day. An hour a day, 5 days a week is not an appropriate approach just from my own experience. We've got to have smaller bites and we've got to have larger bites than that. In general, I find that I can keep the focus of a group of students for about 40 to 45 minutes a day. Now, if we're working on a project, that can extend for hours. It can extend to a couple of hours at certain points if we're working on something that's really big. There might be an awful lot that they've got to get through, but only once we have gotten to that point. We're not throwing a group of students into a 2.5-hour project to try to make sure that we have the averages of, say, 1,000 points of data without say, having, done a lot of work before that. But I start in smaller bites than that. 30 minutes at the beginning of the year, 28 minutes, 26 minutes, something that it's of that length, and then progressively getting longer so that we have a nice natural progression. And even different times of the year, yeah.
Right. Okay. I think we get back to this question, which I think I'm going to ask it again. I mean, it's asked by Denise here, but I think this is really an understandable question. Can you suggest a good math curriculum for high schoolers? And I know you're saying, you know, it sounds like you're saying, well, they're all, you know, they're all just resources, you know, and so you can use any particular one. But I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are hungering for the, you know, the right curriculum, right? That
Sure.
Is,
right.
You know, so I mean, it seems like a lot. Frankly, Scott, it just seems like a lot to ask, you know, the homeschool parent, you know, for every lesson to kind of sit down and figure out how to make that relevant. It would be nice if somebody had developed a curriculum that kind of did a lot of that thinking for you and led you in that direction.
Right, and the only hesitancy that I have is that curriculum is changing so broadly. But I will say this, that I have used in high school, Brett, I wish I could say whether or not you have one of these resources, but certainly one that folks have used quite successfully is called Everyday Mathematics. It's very popular. It's out of the University of Chicago. It's a balance between these two worlds. It's a balance between the big problems and the balance between the having sort of a training or repetition approach. It's a good one that fits in the middle of that. There's another one that is called IMP, Integrated Mathematics. And that's going to be on the further edge of creating those problem sets. I probably wouldn't start with that one if I were just trying to get one, but if I could get a couple, then I might look for those two. Those would be two nice anchor texts to start with. There's also a book by a gentleman named Stephen Leinwand, Leinwand, and he writes about a lot of very good resources, but one of them is 10 different, I believe it's called 10 different strategies to teach mathematics. It's very, very good. I use that in my own work. That's not content per se, but it'll allow you to look for some of the other resources. I hate to be less specific than that, but those are just starting resources that I would begin with.
Okay, so one was called Everyday Mathematics from the University of Chicago. Another one was called Integrated Mathematics.
That's right.
And do you know who that's from?
I don't. It's called IMP.
IMP. Okay, do you know what the P stands for?
I wish I did. I'm sorry that I don't.
Okay.
I just knew it. There.
And then there's a book, I guess, by this fellow named Leinwand, Leinland.
W-A-N-D, Leinwand.
Oh, W-A-N-D, Leinwand. It's called 10 different strategies. You think 10 different strategies to teach mathematics.
Right, or something like that. And it's just a helpful, and that could go toward apply to any grade, but he gives you resources for some of the upper grades.
Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in a couple more. We only got 2 minutes left, and let me see, where were we? Wow. Okay, we're not going to be able to get through the rest of the questions. I apologize to everybody, but let's get to Monica, who didn't have one of her questions answered. She says, I have used a list of standards for our district as the basis for my science curriculum instead of using a textbook. Could the same be done with math to step outside the textbook and to make it more relevant? Does that make sense? Is there a skeleton list of what a student should know before they head off to college?
Yes, absolutely. So,
well, there are several questions in there. So which? Great. So let's take the first question. Could the same be done with math to step outside the textbook to make it more relevant by just working from the standards, in other words?
Right. So, and I'm so appreciative of this question. I should have actually had it as part of the presentation. I have not. There is something that's called the Common Core. They call them the Common Core State Standards. It was a movement in 2009, going into 2010, and you can look that up on a website. This is the end-all, be-all of resources for mathematics teachers in the country, but they are very, very good. They are focused on less is more, they are very coherent, and they are built in a sort of a spiraling and mastery method. And you can look them up, and you can print off the PDF guide for free. And so that set of standards, everyone should go and print out a copy, and you can work from those standards directly. We do all the time, and they are, in my opinion, they are the best possible representation of thought in terms of what we need to know. I'm not saying I'll teach how we teach that, but the concepts, they are extremely well done.
So that's the skeleton list of what a student should know before they head off to college.
That's right.
Monica asked would be the Common Core for math. Okay. Let me see if we, Stephen Linewans. Thank you, Stephanie. She looked it up already. It's called Accessible Mathematics, 10 Instructional Shifts That Raise Student Achievement. Oh, she's asking if that's the book, Stephen Linewans.
Yes.
That's the book. Okay. Well, listen, everybody, we've come to the end of the hour. We may get cut off here. I thank you all for attending. I found it, Scott, very informative when we did our trial run together. I just thought it was really, really interesting. And, you know, if it gets people's gray cells working, then that's a good thing. And so just for everybody, we will have this recorded, and we'll have it on the website. We'll let you know if you want to listen to it again or refer it to your friends. We'll figure out how we're going to get it on the website, and we'll let you know in the newsletter. So, Scott, fantastic, great job. Appreciate your taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for your patience and us getting going there. I had to come downstairs and shut up the phone, but I hope as you take this away, I just hope you take away that there really is a wonderment in mathematics, and I'm just excited to be able to share this with you today. Thanks so much for your time.
Yes, and I'm going to put you on the spot and ask if you'd be willing to come back again some other time.
Absolutely. We actually have five more tips that we didn't include, so it would be 10 total, and I think that'd be a really good follow-up.
Oh, what a great teaser. We'll end on that. Thanks again. Goodbye, everybody.
Okay, thanks so much.